Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this evening's event. Our Vecinos, or Neighbors, lecture series is an integral part of the Institute's Latin America initiative. Since its inauguration in 2008, the series has addressed some of the most important issues affecting Latin America, and tonight is no different. Next year, Mexico will elect a new president. The results of the election will have vast consequences, not only for the future of Mexico, but also for the United States-Mexico relationship. Mexico's emergence from 7 decades of single-party rule has been on balance a historic success, but it has not been without very serious strains. The bitterly contested results of the 2006 election reveal a highly polarized electorate, and next year's contest will take place against the backdrop of high levels of drug-related violence and economic uncertainty. You will be discussing these and other vital issues this evening, and we are fortunate to have 4 distinguished scholars from Mexico and the United States to address them. Late last month, the Baker Institute announced the appointment of former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson as our Senior Fellow for Latin America. We're very happy with this appointment. It highlights the importance the Institute attaches to our expanding Latin America initiative. And this is going to be an initiative here at Rice that goes beyond the Baker Institute. It will be across campus, where we're really going to capitalize on all the assets we have here at Rice and our faculty, students, the total capacities of this university in launching a major Latin America initiative. We feel that we are at the right time and the right place to do this, and Bill Richardson is going to help us guide us on our development of our research agenda. Tonight's panel reflects our ongoing effort to bring the best scholarly minds to bear on this critical region. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel. I would, but before I do that, I want to say that our next event is in the Vecinos Latin America Initiative. It will be on Venezuela, challenges for the new president, which will take place on November 17, 2011. So those of you who are interested in this series, please mark your calendars for November 7th. I'd now like to turn the podium over to our moderator, Morame Lopez Alonso, the professor of history at Rice University, and she will introduce our panel. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, rather than spending time talking about the bios, which are available in the brochure, we'll let the panel start, and then we will open the floor for questions after the presentations are made. Thanks. So, and our first presenter is Joy Langston.
Oh, I could. Let's see if it comes back. Hold on. There we go. All right. Thank you. I would like to thank all of those from the Baker Center for inviting me here. This is my first time not only at the Baker Center, but also at Rice University and also in Houston, Texas. So this is very exciting for me to be here. They asked me to speak about electoral scenarios in Mexico coming up to the 2012 presidential elections. And so I'm a specialist in Mexican parties, especially the PRI. The PRI was a hegemonic party. It was created in 1929 to sort of end these terrible political, violent conflicts between or among revolutionary generals who wanted to become the next president of Mexico. This was an extremely successful hegemonic party, one of the most successful authoritarian parties in all of the world, and it lasted for 71 years in power before it was finally thrown out of the presidency in very fair, open, transparent elections in the year 2000. Now here we are, we find ourselves in 2012, and as I will show you in a slide, the candidate, Enrique Peña Nieto, is now something like 30 points ahead of any of his other competitors from the PAN or the PRD, the center-right PAN or PAN, National Action Party, or the center-left PRD, which I call the PRD. All right. And the reason I have a cute little dinosaur on here is because The PRI, if I can get this little sucker working. No, can I? Oops, I just turned it off, sorry. I'm looking for the little yellow light. Oh well, who cares? Well, you can see the little dinosaur here, and here he's in a nice manifestation. The reason that dinosaurs are associated with the PRI is because in any authoritarian party, after 40, 50 years, you're going to sort of slow down and become calcified. And so the political joke in Mexico was that the PRI by the 70s, the 60s or 70s, had become like a dinosaur. And it was going to be very hard for this dinosaur to evolve. And so what a lot of political analysts were hoping by the 80s and 90s, that the dinosaur of the PRI would go the way of other dinosaurs, which is to sort of fall over and die. And however, as we can see by the happy face, the dinosaur is not dead. The dinosaur has evolved, something that dinosaurs tend not to do, but in our case, it has. I just want to lay out some of the most relevant, obviously only the most relevant, political institutions in Mexico so we have an idea of what we're talking about. First thing is very crucial, it's federalism. In Mexico, the governors are directly elected. They have their own budgets. They tend to be very wealthy. They have a lot of political control over their parties in their respective states. They tend to control candidate selection, or at least heavily influence candidate selection for their respective parties at both subnational and national levels. There is no consecutive re-election in Mexico, which weakens the individual office seeker or politician against his party leaders. And this is something that's very crucial, and it explains why there's such really strong legislative discipline in the Mexican Chamber of Deputies. There's a mixed system of both plurality or SMD, single-member districts, with a proportional representation system. So the party leaders tend to go into the closed lists because they can't really win direct elections because they're not very popular, whereas local politicians tend to go through the SMDs. And then finally, well, we're talking about the presidential election, so Mexico is a presidentialist, federalist system, much like with a strong plurality element, so it's very like the U.S. in at least constitutionally. All right. Now, when we're talking about the PRI, it's really important to understand that the PRI used to win every single election with huge margins. Both the presidential elections, the gubernatorial, senatorial, congressional elections, they lost very few direct elections, even mayoral elections. It was very difficult to find any sort of medium or large city that was governed by a party that was not the PRI. And so what we see here is we look from the 80s, and you can see these margins. This is just the pre-local elections. These are mayoral elections, and the pre-gubernatorial elections. The open spaces because some years they don't have gubernatorial elections. So you can see this really strong downward slide between 1980 and 1995 with a huge dip in 88. So it's not just the presidential election that went badly for the PRI in 88, it was every type of election. But what's even more interesting is when you look from 95 and especially from 2000 onward, there is not a collapse of the PRI vote at the local and state levels. What does this mean? This means that the PRI survives some people call it the caves of the local and state elections, which gives them the possibility to come back very strong. This is a presidential system, and what matters in presidential elections, it's both party ID and the image of the candidate. Extremely important. So, no collapse of the PRI. Here, now we're just going to turn to sort of the 2012 elections and leave the history of the PRI and the party system behind. And what we see here are there's some pretty serious problems in Mexico, and obviously Alberto and Jorge are going to speak much more in depth about some of these problems. But basically we have low economic growth, we have a good deal of corruption, weak political institutions, especially the judicial institutions and the electoral institutions, bad public education. The parties sort of fight with each other so they don't give a victory to the other side. There's a lot of violence because of narco, and you don't have the world's greatest banking sector either. I'm sure Alberto has this data point, but it's something like 70%, 65 to 70% of the Mexican population does not have a bank account in Mexico. All right, and this is just the GDP growth per year. And it's pretty clear what's going on here. You see, you have sort of really not great growth from 2003. It's very anemic, and there's a reason why there is not an M in the term BRIC, because these numbers do not rate the Brazilian, the Russia before, and the Indian and Chinese growth rates. These are extremely anemic growth rates, especially considering where Mexico is and where it sends its manufacturing goods. So it's very tied to the U.S. Economic engine. And so you see how terribly it does in 2009, 2010, and it's just coming back, and now the U.S. seems to be going sort of downward again, and so the Mexican economy will go downward again. So this is creating really a lot of problems for a very large population, over 10 million now in Mexico. All right. So now, how do voters see these problems? This is a poll done by Mitofsky. Mitofsky is a very well-respected pollster in Mexico, and he basically asked the same question over the last 10 years. And so you see the light blue at the top is economic crises or problems. And then comes public security issues. This is not just narco. This also includes, do you think that public security understood as extortion, kidnapping, just regular everyday robbery, as well as narco violence, constitutes the largest problem Mexico is facing today. But what's I think really, and then unemployment, which disappeared, sorry about that. And then what I think is really interesting is corruption is not as bad as it is. And I have numbers, but I didn't put them on this because we have too much to do. As bad as it is, and it's really bad in Mexico, Mexicans themselves don't perceive corruption as the major, not even close, it's not even the top 3 of major problems to confront. So now I'm going to turn to party ID. And there are a lot of really interesting things here. But I can't find it. So what we have here, the top line, the black line with the little X's, are non-identifiers, or what would be called independents. Thank you. Where is it?
Oh, God.
Don't worry about it. I did the same thing.
Is there a laser on there?
There's a red one that shows up better on this.
Oh, here we go. Maybe,
Oh.
Maybe if you could do
I can
this.
bring down a plane with this
Yeah,
thing.
you could.
Okay, here we go. Right. Oh, here we go. All right, so now you can't see this either. But on the top line, what you have are non-identifiers, or independents, as they be called in the U.S. These are people who refuse to sort of state or admit that they have an identification with the one party over another. But look at the next line. That's the blue line. That's the PRI. Which means even after the disastrous electoral showing in 2006 under a terrible candidate who was Roberto Madrazo, whereas the PRI's presidential numbers and the federal deputy numbers and the senatorial numbers come crashing down because the president was such a bad candidate, even then the PRI had a higher number of identifiers in the Mexican voting population than the party in power, which is the PAN, which is this line here. And then here's the Puro PRD. Even though the PRD did extremely well in 2006 elections, the best it had ever done, we're talking like 33 or 34% of the presidential vote, it still doesn't have identifiers because it's just not a party that has managed to reach into sort of the localities of Mexico and pull in voters in a permanent basis. And what's also interesting, if we look at this really high non-identifiers, that means that campaigns matter in Mexico, especially campaigns for the presidency. There's a lot of money involved. There's tons of media and time involved. There's a lot of information that's being delivered to the voting population. And with 40% of your electorate sort of floating around, they're willing and able to be both mobilized so they will vote and to turn their electoral preference to your party. So parties matter. All right, here we go, very quickly. What we here have is the center-right PAN. They just decided on a closed primary. That means that only party members can vote in this primary. And the most likely winner is Josefina Vázquez Mota, who is tied or close to the president. She probably is not his first preference, but the president, Calderón, is perfectly happy to see her win the nomination. And so they have a very strange system here. It's very regulated. And so the start of the pre-campaign begins in the middle of December when nobody's paying attention because everyone in Mexico is off at the beach eating and drinking. And it ends, the pre-campaign ends in the middle of February. The centrist PRI, this is the most fun because it's an open primary of all voters, all registered voters get to vote in this primary. And this is the primary that I give it about a 10% chance of actually coming to fruition. So that means that the other contender, whose name is, he's the head of the PRI's delegation in the Senate, Manlio Fabio Beltrones. Beltrones will say, of course I'm a PRI candidate, of course I'm running for this. And in a week or two before the actual vote, he's going to step back and say, no, I recognize that I can't win it, and so we're not going to do it. But if you run this pre-campaign, i.e. the campaign to choose the candidate, you get time from IFE for radio and television spots. So I think that's probably why they're doing it. And then here you have the center-left PRD. The opinion poll is going to decide who is the candidate. The former candidate in 2006 who almost won, López Obrador, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or the current head of government of the Mexican federal district, who's basically a governor, Marcelo Ebrard. Marcelo Ebrard, and we're going to see this in the next slide. Here I'm showing you numbers of, this is the most interesting and important because here it's sort of not decided. And what you see is Creel was a very powerful member of the Fox administration. The Fox was president from 2000 to 2006. And he's sort of flatlined. He's not doing badly. He's around from 35 to 37%. But what's interesting is Vázquez Mota, who's a very sort of, she's not a terribly charismatic politician, but she's seen as a very effective politician and one who's not too extremist in her views and one who's able to work with other parties, and she's seen as a good legislator, and she's seen as sort of the competent panista among this field. And so Vázquez Mota, look at these numbers. From December, that's not even a year ago, she's gone from 15%, and she was getting killed by Creel, who's better known, and now she's basically winning, not by much, but still, she's doing very well, and she clearly has a momentum behind her, which is why most people, and because Calderón will not veto her, most people believe that she will win. But this is the interesting thing. Cordero is the president's favorite, and he's dead. He's not even up at 10%, and he will not rise like a phoenix from the ashes. He's not going anywhere. But the point is here, Peña Nieto is the former governor of the state of Mexico, the biggest state, the most powerful industry, the largest population. Peña Nieto has a almost 80% advantage over the second place PRI candidate, who is Beltrones. And so there's no way Beltrones is going to go to an open primary and say, yes, kill me, beat me. He wants power and influence in the next administration, and the reason he's sort of admitting to, or he will go to this confrontation, is so it won't happen. He would never show up and only win, 10, 12% of the vote. It's just not going to happen. But even AMLO, López Obrador, has something like a 40% advantage among only PRD identifiers over Marcelo Ebrard, the current sort of governor of Mexico City. But if you go among the open voting population, they almost even out. AMLO drops considerably. He has terrible negatives against him. Many people will never vote for AMLO. However, people have pretty good views among the general voting population about Ebrard. And so what you're going to see is there's really serious conflict within the PRD over how they're going to run this electoral poll. But most people still think AMLO's going to win. Okay, and these are the preferences. Let's say that I'm right, or the polls are right, and these are the most probable candidates. I mean, Peña Nieto, there's no doubt. So this person is AMLO here, and this person is Vázquez Mota here, and you see that Peña Nieto, as of today, has a 30% margin of victory over either of those two candidates. Now, 30% margin with 40% independent voters is not insurmountable. He can blow this lead. Because as many of us recall in 2005, everyone knew in 2005 that AMLO was going to win. And he didn't win. Now, whether it was because of the actions of Fox, whether it was the actions of the IFE, or was it because he really made very important mistakes in his campaign, it's hard to tease those three factors out. Okay, I'm fine. But what you see here is if the only names are used, so it's just who would you prefer to see win the presidency, PRI, PAN, or PRD? The PRI drops from a 30-point margin to a 20-point margin. So again, large, very large, but not insurmountable. Basically, Peña Nieto needs to really mess up, though, in this campaign. This is not going to be even close unless he makes some very large mistakes, or they find some dirt on him, which is Always the case. There was an electoral reform passed. Some say a terrible reform, some say a wonderful reform passed in 2007. It had many important differences. It's probably the most important electoral reform since 96, probably the most important one since 77 even. So one of the articles of the new COFIPE is a regulatory law that tells IFE how to do its business, says that nobody can start campaigning before the pre-campaign. The pre-campaign starts in, I think, the middle of December. Everyone has started campaigning. So this is what I mean by weak political institutions. These people, they go and they do campaigns, campaign stops. I mean, it's to win the primary, but still, they still have another month and a half before they're allowed to do that, and there are no sanctions. This is not worrisome just because of this one issue. It's worrisome because the IFE is seen as a very weak electoral agency, an electoral watchdog, and it needs to be a strong one. We are talking about 3 very strong parties with a lot of money to spend. Second thing is the new laws say that you can't, and that brings it up to the level of Constitution, and there are sanctions, you can't say anything defamatory against rivals, even if what you're saying can be proven to be true. Now this remains to be seen if this is going to hold, because this clearly goes against the right of freedom of speech, which is enshrined in the Mexican Constitution. So there's no doubt that the regulatory law of the COFIPE says you cannot do this. And there's no doubt that when parties are being harmed by this kind of speech, they're going to go to IFE and say, make it stop. The question is, are they going to be able to make it stop fast enough so that, let's say I say, Moramay stole $20 million from the state of Mexico's coffers when she was governor. Well, it's out there. So the question is, can they stop it quickly enough? And what they're trying to make IFE do is go over every single radio spot and television spot to make sure that nobody says anything mean about any of the other candidates. This puts an enormous responsibility on IFE, which, by the way, is understaffed. Why? Because they haven't put the last 3 electoral counselors in. They haven't voted them in. All right. Campaign season, the parties receive now less money than they used to. This is absolutely true. However, the campaign season is also shortened. So per day, the parties receive as much money as they ever did under the old rules. So they're really awash in public monies. And there's an estimate that was done by IFE that there will be something like 45 million spots in television and radio that will go over the airwaves in the course of the presidential campaign, or all 3 campaigns that take place at once. And this is just an estimate because they still really don't know how many will go through. But this gives you an idea of how media saturated these campaigns are going to be. So now here's a fun graph. This is spending and how parties spent their money in 2006. Parties no longer have to spend money on radio and television. This was like the biggest change of the 2007 electoral law, where the parties got very happy when they said, we can change the law however we please, and what we parties don't want to do is give our money to Televisa or TV Azteca, or the radio stations. And so we're going to force them to air our ads during public time, as it's called, sort of like a public service announcement, but all the political campaigning is now a giant public service announcement. So those 45 million spots are all free. Now, obviously, they're not going to be free. There's a million ways to get around this. But generally speaking, parties do not have to spend all this money that they used to spend, because look at these percentages. Of the total of money that was spent by the parties in 2006, 60% was spent on radio and TV. This money no longer is being spent. So the really interesting question is, where are these parties going to spend all this money? And much of the idea, they're going to spend it on ground campaigns. And the problem with ground campaigns is that they're far more difficult. Ground campaigns mean basically mobilizing your voters, getting them out of their house on Sunday, getting them to come to vote. And how you do that in Mexico, there are a lot of different ways, and many of which are not legal. So the problem is, when you have all this money floating around, because you're getting basically the same amount per day, although it's different in total, where are they going to spend this money? And there are also new fiscalization rules, so I shouldn't exaggerate. They do have slightly stronger instruments with which to audit spending at the local level, but I have my doubts. All right. Now let's talk about what would happen in the case that the PRI did win these elections. And part of the problem, the criticism of the PAN has been that there have been no major policy reforms in the last 12 years. And part of the reason for that is there are no majorities in either the lower or upper house of Congress, so you have an extremely divided government here. The president being held by the PAN, and with no majorities in the Senate or the House until very recently. Now the PRI, together with the Green Party, has a majority in the lower house, but that's only the last 3 years. So there was this idea that whatever the executive wins, the other parties lose. So there's a real zero-sum type of negotiation going on here. It was very bad for business, because if you win, if I give you a win, you're going to take the credit for it if it goes well, but I'm going to share the blame with you if it goes badly. And so this was the problem in terms of reform. The PRD, which is a very disciplined party in Congress, although it's a very undisciplined party outside of Congress, in Congress it votes together. And what's interesting is it does have an identifiable ideological position. However, it has not modernized its vision of how Mexico can grow, sort of a la Lula. You know, if Lula was sort of the American, certainly, leader of the left in the last, since, whatever it was, 2002, the PRD does not follow Lula, does not think it needs to follow Lula. It hasn't modernized. And finally, and this is true for all of the parties, but perhaps most especially for the PRI, it caters, each and every party caters to it the economic elites and their rent-sinking elites. And this happens to be very bad for the collective problem of economic growth in the country. And I'm almost done. So if the PRI wins, many believe there will be majorities in Congress, even if it's a majority with the Green Party, which is a minor party in Mexico. But it's not clear, it's simply not clear what the PRI wants, because Peña Nieto refuses to make a clear statement either about political reform, labor reform, fiscal reform, or reform of the energy sector. So we're sort of, nobody knows what he would do. It could be he would be a future Menem, and he would just sort of go neoliberal. Or it could be that he could, I'm exaggerating, he couldn't be an Alan Garcia Peru, but he could simply sort of continue the policies of muddling through for another 6 years, which would not do Mexico or its economy any good. And I'm pretty much done, right? So I don't need to talk about whether the pre-negotiate, because Jorge Chabat will talk about that. And then for all this sort of terrible things I just said about Mexico, I wanted to end on a positive note, which is this is an outlook for the future that the Pew survey does this survey. It's very comparable across the U.S. and Mexico, so I really like this. And basically the question is the same to Americans, a nationally representative sample of Americans and Mexicans. And the question is, will the next generation be better off or worse off? And what you see here is for Americans, twice as many think it'll be worse off than better off. This was taken in 2007, before the economic crisis, by the way. Versus Mexico, which is sort of half and half. And the rest will say the same. Mexicans tend to be far more optimistic about the near and middle term than Americans are. Again, repeat myself, before the economic crisis in 2008. If I think we took this same poll again, it would be even more dramatic. And I am done, and thank you so much for your time.
Chabat will talk about security.
Good. Oops, this is not designed for computers. Yeah, great. Good. Okay, so let me just synchronize this. Good. How does it work? Okay, good.
There we are, where we are now.
Okay, okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Baker Center. I'm very glad to be here in Houston, especially during the World Series where the Texas Rangers are, they were defeated yesterday, but well, they will win. So I'm going to talk about a problem that you You probably hear about it all the time in the media, which is crime, organized crime in Mexico, violence, and all these ugly things that happen in my country. How this problem is evolving, what are the challenges for Mexico and the U.S., especially thinking ahead. So, well, first of all, I will say, well, where are we now? I would say Mexico is in the middle of frontal war declared by President Calderon to drug trafficking and organized crime. Is more than drug trafficking. That's part of the problem. Nowadays, there are approximately 40,000 soldiers and 30,000 federal policemen deployed on Mexican territory to fight organized crime, and there are around 45,000 drug-related deaths during this administration. Nobody knows exactly if this figure is real or not, but in general, there is an agreement that these deaths are in some way related to organized crime. The government says that 90% of these deaths are, drug traffickers killing each other, which probably is true, but we don't know an exact way to prove that. What is amazing is that despite these figures, there's still a support of the Mexican public to this war. According to the Pew Hispanic Center, a recent poll of August this year, even now, 83% of Mexicans support the use of army to fight organized crime, which is incredibly high. Only but this is still high. 45% think that the government is making progress in the war against drugs, cartels. I mean, these figures are very high considering the levels of violence we have in Mexico, and the explanation for that is probably because people don't see any more options. That's part of the problem in Mexico. Also, we have a process of fragmentation of the drug cartels during this administration. They are fragmented, but they are more violent, probably because of that. That's what explains the peak of violence we have seen during the last years. And another important element I have to mention is that some criminal groups are dedicated to predatory crimes. I mean, we have not only the traditional drug traffickers that sell drugs, kill other drug traffickers, but now we have groups that attack the society. They make extortion, kidnapping, human smuggling, especially the Zetas, La Familia, and now the Knights Templar. Knights Templar, I don't know why they are called this way, but and they are dressed like the Knights Templar. In Michoacán, these guys are terrible. I mean, I'm not saying that the Sinaloa cartel, the Chapo Guzman, they are, like good people, no, but they all dedicated to the business of selling drugs, and the most of the violence against population is developed by the Zetas and La Familia. Also, I have to mention that there is a support of the U.S. administration, the U.S. government in general, to the Calderon administration. But as you may know, there is a big concern about the effects of Mexico's drug war in U.S. territory. So let's see. Well, one question I have to ask is how did we arrive to this situation? Well, I would say that drug trafficking was not a serious national security threat in Mexico until the 1980s. It became a serious problem in the 1980s when Mexico became a point of crossing for South American cocaine, and also there was a sort of balloon effect. There was a counter operation, a program of the government combating the production of marijuana, and this operation moved drug traffickers to produce or to go into the trade of cocaine. The situation got worse in the mid-1990s, where Colombian cartels, as you know, were dismantled, and then we have the big Mexican cartels, the big four. the Tijuana, the Juarez, the Gulf, and the Sinaloa cartels that survived during the 1990s. They were, like a kind of dinosaurs in the world of organized crime. And also, I think that an important element in this situation is that we had until the 2000s a policy. The Mexican government had a policy of tolerance vis-a-vis drug trafficking. It's what I call the Pax Narcotica. The idea that you don't bother these guys. You send them some message. You can do this and this. Don't kill too much people, too many people, and that's fine. Well, to be honest, that policy allowed to have relatively low levels of drug-related violence during some years, but obviously it did not stop the problem. Actually, the problem continued growing. It got worse and worse, and at some point, organized crime became so powerful. So powerful, and the old rules didn't work anymore. And this policy was not sustainable, and that's an important point I want to put attention on. Is that this policy was designed to be a failure because it was not sustainable. It was based on the assumption that drug trafficking or organized crime was going to remain the same all the time. And it changed. It became more and more powerful. And there was a moment when they say, okay, well, the old agreement doesn't work anymore. Now I'm going to kill people. So what? And the government has not the power to stop that. That's basically how this policy failed. And that's, from my point of view, what put us in this situation right now. What happened in the 2000s? Well, many things happened in the 2000s that can explain why we entered into this wave of violence. On the one hand, there was the arrival of an opposition party, as you know, the National Action Party, to the presidency in 2000. It caused a breaking of arrangements that were established between the political power and drug trafficking. The old agreements were broken with the new authorities. Also, the Fox administration arrested big drug lords, and there was some kind of equilibrium among drug cartels. Suddenly, one cartel was more powerful than others, and actually, this violence started in 2005 when the Sinaloa cartel saw the opportunity of attacking the Gulf cartel that was very weakened because of the arrest of his leader. Another element was, and that's very important, and increasing the domestic consumption of illegal drugs in Mexico. It was a growing problem since the mid-1990s, supposedly because Colombian cartels began to pay Mexican cartels not in cash but with drugs. So they were forced to fine, or they have some incentive to fine consumers in Mexico. And part of the violence we are seeing right now is because these cartels are fighting for the corner. They kill you because this is my corner. You cannot sell drugs here. If you sell drugs here, I kill you. Even when the money involved is not so big. That's very important because the size of the legal market of drugs in Mexico is not so high. It's probably less than $1 billion a year, but they kill you anyway. And that's part of the explanation for the violence we are seeing right now. Also, as I mentioned, the fight for the domestic markets, along with broken equilibriums among drug cartels, provoked that there was some fight for territorial control of some parts of Mexico. For example, Michoacan, the war on drugs that Calderon started was in Michoacan, where there were some groups controlling what was happening in that territory. So from my point of view, there were not many alternatives, not many options for the government than to fight these guys. And also, well, in the 2000s, you also may know that this violence provoked serious conflicts with the United States, since 2005. It started in Nuevo Laredo, then it continued in many other places. In the 1990s, the U.S. government used to complain about corruption in Mexican police forces. Now the United States is complaining about violence in Mexico, and that's probably one of the characteristics of the bilateral relationship right now. Well, what is the Calderon strategy? I will say that Calderon's strategy against drug trafficking, or organized crime in general, has three main components. One is what you see on the media every day, the police military operations in some parts of Mexico that has caused criticism for the use of military in fighting drugs, institutional reforms that are in progress, and international cooperation like the Berry Initiative, which is not progressing in an important way, but is still there. And Calderon basically wants to achieve two goals with this strategy: a fragmentation of drug cartels that can reduce the levels of violence in the long term, and additionally a strengthening of the state institutions that allows Mexican government to control, not to eliminate, but to control drug trafficking, or at least the effects of violence that we have in Mexico right now. The long-term goal is to transform drug trafficking into a public security problem, public safety problem, instead of a national security problem, like in the U.S. That's what I call. Sometimes they say, well, this is the colonization of Mexico. Well, in theory, the goal is to Americanize Mexico. I mean, to have the problem in the way you have it here in the U.S., that you have consumption of drugs, all the sale of drugs, but you don't have, beheaded corpses on the street. No? That's the difference, and it's a big difference. Well, very quickly, what are I didn't put that on time. So sorry about it. That's why you were looking at me. What does this guy say? Well, okay, that's what I said. Okay. Institutional, police military operations, institutional reforms, international cooperation, etc. Well, okay. So, what are the institutional reforms that Calderon has made during the past years? Well, very quickly, there are some changes: house arrest up to 60 days for organized crime cases, intervention of communications in case of organized crime, investigation faculties to police forces, establishment of a single national police certification system at all levels, federal, state, and municipal level, seizure of properties used for organized crime activities, judicial reform establishing oral trials in an 8-year period. It started in 2008, so in principle we will have this new system working in 2016. I'm not very optimistic about it, but in theory we will have that in 2016. And a reform to the national system of public security. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, just in order to have an idea of what's going on there. The national system of public security law changed some very important things. It created a single national police report. Probably some of things these things are very familiar to you. You say, well, you're doing this right now. Yeah, we haven't done this before. The career service in justice institutions, police career and police professionalization, a national system of certification and confidence control, and the vetting processes, which is very important to fight corruption. A single national system of public security with information about the criminals, the arms, and all kind of national registers regarding public security, sanctions to those who do not provide information on public security, especially states and some municipalities, suspension of system resources to states or municipalities that do not provide this information, that do not certify personnel of public security institution, and also to those who does not establish and maintain confidence control or betting processes, or use resources for other purpose than those established in the law. Well, what's the diagnosis of the problem from my point of view? I would say that the failure in the combat of drug trafficking is caused by the inability of the Mexican state to enforce laws against drugs. If this assumption is true, basically there are three options. Tolerate the phenomenon like in the past, the Pax Narcotica, combat it with the resources you have, or modify the inability of the Mexican state to enforce laws in order that the Mexican will be more efficient in enforcing law. In the short run, only the two first options are viable. Actually, we have this policy of tolerance during many years. The third option, to modify the inability of Mexican states to enforce law, will mean changing the law, what this basically legalizes drugs in some way, or strengthening state capacities. I mean, that's the only way that you can, make a match between the reality and the law. There is an opposition in the U.S., as you know, to modify laws against drug trafficking. Oh, 3 minutes? No, don't tell me that. Well, or even that possibility, discuss that possibility, strengthening Mexican state is the only sustainable option. However, legalization of drugs, from my point of view, does not solve the problem of predatory crime, extortion, kidnappings, human trafficking. Well, there are some magic bullets. Some people that say I have the magic solution. We have to confiscate money, take the money to the criminals, just tell me how. You need more resources to do that and more people to do that. Creation of millions of jobs, gun control, disappearance of consumption of drugs. Oh yeah, tomorrow, well, that's easy, no? Some people say, why don't you negotiate with organized crime? Other people say, do nothing until the state is strong enough to fight organized crime. Well, I don't think these solutions are going to work and solve the problem. Well, the Calderon's bet, as I mentioned, is a fragment and control strategy. Basically, it wants to fragment the cartels in order to control them. There are three obstacles to this strategy: corruption, human rights abuses, and time. If high levels of violence persist, how long can people accept violence? Well, that's a big question. Well, for the U.S., there is a dilemma, a stick or carrot with Mexico. So far, violence in Mexico has not been exported to U.S. territory, as you know. U.S. institutions seem to be strong enough so far. However, there is a growing concern in the American public about the impact of violence on U.S. There is a fear of narco-terrorists, as you know, all the time. I think the American institutions are very, very strong, so I don't think this is a serious threat right now. But the U.S. has this dilemma to put pressure on Mexico or give the stick or carrot. Well, I'm going to finish right now. What to do? The Mexican government must have an integrated strategy that contemplates prevention too, in order to hinder the aggravation of the problem in the future. Not only to solve the problem right now, but to look for the future consequences of that. Mexican government has to prioritize efforts in combat of corruption. It must concentrate resources in fighting predatory crime, those who attack population. It must invest in technology and intelligence capabilities. It must combine the Mexican and American public that a strengthening institution is the only sustainable solution. And U.S. must prioritize aid for institution building in Mexico. The U.S. government should combine the American public that collaboration with Mexico is more rewarding than confrontation. In conclusions, I will say that the policy of confrontation with organized crime was the only short-term option for the Calderon administration. However, has not been successful because the problem is structural. The Mexican state lacks the tools to fight this threat. It's a problem of tools, not of strategy. It doesn't have the institutions. The next American administration won't have margins for maneuver for making big changes in this strategy. In other words, unfortunately, I think violence will persist for some time. Obviously, in the campaigns of 2012, the opposition parties will say, I'm going to make things differently. They don't have margin for maneuver. They are not going to make things very differently. That's the truth. The U.S. government will use a stick and carrot with Mexico at the same time. It will be a kind of schizophrenic policy. They will put pressure on Mexico and they will give aid both at the same time. And in the long run, the only sustainable solution to control organized crime in Mexico is institution building. It is in the U.S. interest to contribute to that. the new Mexican president could be tempted to go back to the Pax Narcotica policy, but that policy won't work in the long run because basically you don't have the authority to make it work and the power to make it work. And finally, if Mexico fails in control of organized crime, the United States institution will face an enormous challenge. Some people can talk about the Mexicanization of the States. I don't think this is an immediate problem, an immediate challenge, an immediate threat. But, well, it's a possibility. But many things should happen before we arrive to this scenario. Well, okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Now Alberto Díaz-Caballeros is going to talk about economic perspectives.
No, I don't need that. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Erica, and the Baker Institute, and thank you, Moramay. It's a pleasure to be here with these very dear friends as well in the panel. I have to say from the beginning that I will disappoint a little bit by not really talking about economic perspectives. And in some ways, the reason is something which I think already has been foreshadowed in some of the graphs that Joy showed you of economic performance in Mexico. And it is that the perspective, I think, for 2012 is really, modeling through. It's just keep on doing what's been happening in Mexico and not much excitement. And it will be much more interesting to see what happens with the drug war or what happens with politics than to try to think of what's happening with the Mexican economy. So instead, I took a cue from the challenges for the new president title of the symposium to think a little bit about a more long-term view and a more long-range view about, what's the prospects for the Mexican economy beyond 2012. So the Mexican economy has grown historically at an incredibly mediocre rate. It has not been more remarkable than the world economic growth since 1950, nor has the country been any more dynamic than any of its peers in the last decade. On average, the economy has grown since the 1920s at 1.6% per year. So this is a very slow growth, but it produces remarkable transformations in any society. If you grow at 1.6 during 90 years, you move into a system in which the country is no longer characterized by, vast expanses of rural dwellers, although in the countryside it is where we have the most concentration of extreme poverty, particularly among indigenous populations. Mexico is today an urban country. Of course, that 1.6% allows you to get higher literacy rates, higher life expectancy. Income has increased to a point where Mexico is no longer, I don't think we can think of Mexico as a poor developing country. But Mexico is not rich. And that's what I really want to talk about today. So growth has never reached the standards of dynamism of the East Asian newly industrialized countries. Even during the so-called Mexican miracle in the 1960s, the growth rates of the economy, which people were saying were incredible, were actually not equivalent improvements in well-being because fertility rates were extremely high. So population was also growing at a fast pace, and therefore GDP per capita was not really growing very fast. There's also this window of opportunity of something called the demographic bonus, in which you start having this moment when the working age population peaks as a share of total population. This is a demographic phenomenon. It has nothing to do with what politicians or policymakers do. And then, of course, at some point, the aging population increases the dependency ratio. So you have this window of opportunity. Well, it turns out Mexico, that window is closing very quickly on Mexico. So we did not get that. That produced growth in a lot of economies in the world in the last 10, 20 years. The North American Free Trade Agreement, North American integration, it brought many benefits to firms and to workers. But the overall growth rate of the Mexican economy as a result of NAFTA has never been what it was promised. And then, finally, the last commodity boom of the last 10 years, which has provided this incredible dynamic push to the economies all over Latin America, it did not do much in Mexico. So what's wrong with Mexico's growth? What has been missing as an engine of economic prosperity? And let me just sort of rule out a couple of things first. It is not something about entrepreneurial culture or about ambition. Mexicans are also extremely hardworking people. And I don't really need to say that in a place like Texas, but in many places of the U.S., people don't know that. One of the things we have to think about is that the country is capable of producing extremely sophisticated goods. There would not be a North American automobile industry today if it were not for the way in which the Mexican car and auto parts sort of manufacturers are able to integrate into this industry. Mexico has global companies like cement or telecommunications. We should say these are sort of relatively well-known stories of Mexican success. Perhaps less frequently, and this sort of moves a little bit into a different angle on Jorge Chabat's presentation, there is this ingenuity and resilience of Mexican entrepreneurs in one particular line of business that has received much attention, namely, and it is the shipping of illegal narcotics to the U.S., which it has to be recognized, it has been admirable. In spite of a frontal assault by the Mexican government to eradicate them, and the uncertainties created by violent confrontations with one another, these economic organizations, we usually refer to them as drug cartels, they continue creating enormous amounts of cash. They pay retailing on networks on both sides of the border. They subcontract violence and protection. They manage financial assets worldwide, money laundering, and they employ an unknown share of the Mexican labor. Let's look at it in a more bright light, in some unexpected sectors, Mexican companies have been extremely successful. Mexican retailers, for example, Mexican retail is actually quite remarkable. In spite of the dominance of Walmart, this is a new phenomenon. Before that, Mexican retailers were providing accessible, competitively priced goods to Mexican households in almost any town in the country. The housing industry has had this incredible boom, during the last few years, at a whopping case of 600,000 new homes built every year, which Mexico had never seen something like that, thanks to this virtuous combination of, on the one hand, a federal government which restructured the housing institutions, on the other hand, the guarantee of macroeconomic stability, and effective financial intermediation by banks, which are providing, in spite of this lack of financial intermediation, they're providing the lowest mortgage rates in Mexico, at least in my memory. Some areas of agribusiness are incredibly dynamic. This is something that has actually allowed for a reduction in some of the poverty indicators in some areas of the country, because what has happened is you have allowed some communities of very poor peasants to escape extreme poverty and become, I think the word is farmers, no longer peasants, farmers. There is a food processing industry that has witnessed this emergence of really remarkable companies like Lala or Bimbo, which have established diverse business models, and they're really, challenging in these diverse business models in the global economy, not just within Mexico. Mining, there has been all these joint ventures between Mexican and foreign companies that have generated dynamism in this sector that had not been seen for a century. And by the way, this mining boom has produced prominent billionaires, which are all in the Forbes list under Carlos Slim. But it has produced all these other millionaires. The tourist industry, in spite of the global recession, in spite of the H1N1 influenza and the perception of Mexico being this incredibly dangerous destination, they're still coming. I mean, nobody should be coming with the numbers and the things that Jorge has shown us. Then there's also studies about managerial capacity of Mexican companies. It turns out that in a comparative study, Nick Bloom at Stanford did this. He found that the Mexican entrepreneurs, the managers, do things by the book, do them much better than almost any other country of the Mexican peers. And NAFTA is a guarantee, it is a very important guarantee, that at least on the tradable sector of the economy, a firm cannot survive if it is not able to produce more value than whatever it gets as inputs. So these are all good news. So what's wrong? Despite all these success stories, what is it about, of course, I've already sort of sipped in one word, the tradables. Okay, so what is it in the non-tradables of the economy, which is the largest part of the Mexican economy probably, that have not provided an engine for growth? So economists have talked about this and have really worked on this in the last few years. And the shorthand they have come to diagnose this problem is that Mexico has an economic growth that is characterized by a huge productivity gap. According to, for example, an IDB study, a study for the Inter-American Development Bank, Mexico, in fact, has had periods and many sectors in which total factor productivity, which is the way in which economists measure this, I'll explain it in a second, has been either negative or zero. That is the total factor of productivity. The idea is when you account for all the inputs you put and you add into the production process, such as the inputs are things like additional years of schooling of the workers or additional workers or capital investments. So you put all these things there. The value that the outputs of the Mexican economy is basically the same as the value of the inputs you have put into the productive process. So there's not much that you're generating in that process. This is growth accounting, however, is only an accounting exercise. It does not provide any explanation of why it is happening. But Mexican productivity is very low. So, in some ways, part of it, of course, is, this TFP, total factor of productivity, is a residual. It's very hard to know exactly what's going on in there. But it signals that this is one of the questions that we really need to address. In a recent article in the Journal of Economic Literature, Gordon Hanson, who is my colleague at UCSD, he has just done a systematic review of the literature on Mexico, trying to figure out why Mexico is not rich. And what he shows is that the economists are currently discussing work and hypotheses in three major areas. One is a series of studies that suggest that it is something about the social policy of Mexico, the way in which employment and social policy, labor markets and social policy work together, that has had, and this is sort of an unintended effect of social policy. I'll tell you a little bit about what this is. And that has had a very perverse effect in labor markets. There's a second set of papers, which is a more sort of traditional, long view that has always been there, is at least for the last 20 years, that there's something about deficient regulation of economic activity that has led to monopolistic power in firms, but not just in firms, also in things like unions in Mexico. And the third one is a hypothesis which is in a way sort of not necessarily, these are not necessarily substitutes, which is that the problem is a deficient process of human capital formation, which is generated by an incredibly deficient education system. So I will discuss mostly the first two. The third is also very important, mostly associated with James Heckman, Nobel Prize in Economics, labor economist. But I will sort of tell you a little bit about some of these long-term views of what's happening with labor markets, what's happening with social policy, and how does that link with regulation. Santiago Levy, in particular, who's one of the main proponents of this articulation of what's wrong with Mexican productivity, has argued that the labor regimes in Mexico have created these low levels of competition and entrenched interests in very critical sectors of the economy. So the unions, for example, are sources of rents to their members, something that Joy mentioned earlier. They have created very important bottlenecks in critical sectors of the Mexican economy, and this has reduced the competitiveness of the economy. But another insight in his work, this comes from a book called Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes, is that even something like social policy, which in principle should be something that is good for everyone, has increased, so this social policy, which has increased the role of the state, for example, in providing insurance to the uninsured workers, that is called the Seguro Popular, or the conditional cash transfer program of Oportunidades, which Santiago started, and this is one of the most important social innovations that has happened in Mexico in the last decades. They have had the unintended consequence of creating some effects in labor markets and productivity, which are actually quite perverse. What happens is that workers in Mexico today, they previously basically had to enjoy the benefits of a truncated welfare state. Not everyone got the welfare state, but if you were in the formal sector of the economy and you were a member of the IMSS, or maybe if you were part of the confederations of peasants who also got all these agricultural subsidies and fertilizers and insurance from the state, this kind of allowed you to know that you could, be a member of these traditional organizations and therefore, be protected. Turns out that now, in the current system, it is no longer obvious for a worker or a firm, also for an employer, whether it is better to seek work in formal sectors of the economy, belong to things like labor unions and labor organizations to get some insurance and some benefits, or whether you should do this outside the formal channels. Because in some ways, when you think about this, neither the traditional Social Security was providing all the things that workers were supposed to get, nor the new systems of coverage, can assure you that you're getting universal access. But once you start seeing this trade-off, it is not obvious why Mexican workers or Mexican firms should really be working in the formal sector of the economy. So Mexico is caught a little bit on a dilemma in which the sort of, if you have a system which is occupationally based to decide who gets insurance, for example, for health insurance, this occupationally based system, which is being financed by the contributors, is not going to be attractive for all the ones who are getting insurance through the payroll, through the general taxation, through the things like Seguro Popular or support through oportunidades. There is an additional aspect to all of this, of course, that it is that labor unions and some of the organized workers in some of the key sectors of the economy have been able to capture a lot of rents from their privileged position in those sectors in the economy. These rents have also extended into the firms themselves. We should not be so naive about this, that it's always the workers' fault. It's also the firms and the business and the stockholders of those firms that are getting benefits from the way in which this system works. So we know, for example, the case of Pemex. I'll talk about Pemex in a minute. We know the cases of the utility companies, one of them which is no longer there, and also the market share of a sector like telecommunications, like Telmex. And although Mexico has antitrust legislation and a commission and all that, it is very clear that the rulings are just simply dismissed by this dominant stakeholders, and the courts cannot really do much. So I have to say something about oil because I'm in Houston. And I'm sorry that I have to talk about this very briefly, but because I have just a few minutes, but Mexico is running out of oil. We know that. And we know, for example, that the fields in Chicontepec, which is the large oil field that has increased the proven reserves in Mexico, cannot be extracted with the Mexican current skills or technology. So oil revenue will probably decline over the next few years, but we have to take into account that the evolution of oil revenue has not really been just something about the price of international price of oil or the capacity to extract oil very easily, which is what has happened with Pemex. The real curse of Mexico is not oil. It is that we happen to strike a particular oil field, Cantarell, which was so easy to extract that it allowed this company to just not invest anywhere else because Cantarell was good enough. But anyway, what I want to stress is that the oil that is produced by Pemex is not just produced because of Pemex, it's sort of the international price of oil, or because of the oil that is extracted. The revenue is produced because there is also a bargain that is being struck between the company and the finance ministry. And the company and the finance ministry have this asymmetric information about who knows how much it really costs to extract a barrel of oil in Mexico. So Pemex has insider information regarding this true cost. And the management uses its discretion in the distribution of rents, and these rents are given to the company itself. They're also given to a web of private contractors, which we should not forget, and many of them are also here in this area. And then we also have, within this sort of equation, a very powerful union. All these rents are together, and they're the ones who keep this system in shape. Now, why does this system work, however? Part of the reason why this system works is because the federal government, is trying to think, okay, how much can I tax Pemex? Then the federal government also thinks, I don't want to delay investment in exploration. We need to make sure that we do some exploration. And the company itself also knows that this is also true for its long-term viability. But nothing in the system is forcing the company to think in a long term. And the reason why nothing forces you to think about the long term is because the main beneficiaries of this particular regime are all the other sectors of business in Mexico and all the other would-be taxpayers that are not having to pay the taxes that Mexico would need. So this is a very particular political economy equilibrium. But in general, this equilibrium that I'm talking about is the kind of thing that some people have been working on trying to understand why is it that you have this kind of insider privilege in some key sectors of the Mexican economy. What is the telecommunications sort of perversion really about? And in that case, actually the telecommunications one, in the light of what I just said, actually doesn't look too bad. Because at least the rents that Carlos Slim generated through this telecom monopoly allowed him to become a dominant player in the rest of Latin America and create a world-class company. So that kind of rent maybe is not as bad as the kinds of rents we find in other sectors of the Mexican economy. But there are all these firms in the Mexican economy which are able to survive without having to really face true competition. I had some examples about this also in the stock markets, but all I will say here, because I know I'm running out of time, is that in the stock markets, if you look at the listing at the median year when a company that is listed in the Mexican stock market was listed in 2009, the median year in which a company was listed was in 1961. That's in 2009. 25 years earlier, the median year in which a company was listed was 1963. The Mexican stock market had, in 1966, 66 traded companies, and today it has, let me see the number, if we exclude all the banking brokerages, which are a complex part about this, about 120. So this is an extremely limited pool of resources to raise capital for firms. Now, I have to finish up, so let me tell you something about, okay, in this context, what can we tell to the candidates? What can we think about their economic platforms if we want to unleash growth? What are the economic perspectives beyond 2012? And unless something is done with this political equilibrium, I think Mexico will keep it growing at the low rates, modeling it through. But if Mexico wants to join the ranks of countries that are really doing something different in the world, they have to do something radical. And so what follows is not an analysis. It's more like my desire to see something being unleashed. So one possibility is that you must think that further decentralization would actually open more access in Mexico. But it would mean an incredibly different architecture of the way in which the federal system and the federal pact works in Mexico today. This would be extremely risky because governors are extremely powerful and with very little checks and balances. It would produce very differential effects across the country because some regions would really be able to take advantage of this and others would not. But it is the only way I see that you could unleash some kind of institutional innovation in Mexico, in which Mexican institutions would start to be seen from a local perspective. So today, a municipality in Mexico, for example, is something that is just a mechanism of control and a little bit of policing. The question is, can you transform that municipality into a service provider, a guarantor of public safety, a space of Republican political participation, and a place that unleashes business opportunities? Mexican municipalities today are not any of those things. And the way to ground this a little bit more explicitly is, if you want to think about Ciudad Juárez, just linking this to Jorge Chabat, will Ciudad Juárez, when the violence subsides, if and when it happens, will it become Medellin? In the current institutional makeup of Mexico, my answer is there's no way that you will have a Medellin out of Ciudad Juárez. And in a way, the future of Mexico is going to be about all these mid-sized global new cities, because most of the population lives in cities today. We already have some of them. We have Tijuana, Hermosillo, Aguascalientes, a few of them. But if Mexico does not have 100 or 1,000 of those cities, I don't see very much prospects ahead. Thank you very much.
Now we'll open the floor for some questions that you might have.
Joy, could you tell us a little bit about Peña Nieto in the sense, does he have an international background? Did he study overseas? Does he have languages? He's been governor of a state, but can he govern the entire country? And in the military and intelligence community, does he have a younger generation mentor like Gutierrez Barrios?
Okay. Do you want to take just one at a time, or you want to gather a few?
Let's gather 3 questions and then, yes, another. Yes?
The phrase rent that several of the speakers has used translates in my mind to something like a private tax, a little personal tax for the various interest holders. Am I getting that correctly?
Another question? That's where, yes.
I've heard no real mention of reestablishing, making stronger the judicial system in Mexico, where these problems could be dealt with, and that should certainly have to be centralized and not a state's object. Is there any plan for that? As well as the educational system.
One first
question is for Jorge. I mean, you mentioned, and I fully agree, that the drugs problem is a structural problem, and it's basically the U.S. consumption is next door. So my question is, how far you have to strengthen the Mexican state in order to deal with it? Is that possible to reach that high in order that the Mexican government can handle with such problems?
Okay, so let's...
Peña Nieto is, how can I put this? There used to be a division in Mexico and within the pre-elite through the end of 2000, and this started basically in the 70s, which was there were politicians who were very astute at sort of winning elections, basically, and negotiating with other forces within the regime and with the opposition. And then there were technocrats, and the technocrats were all basically economists who were, educated at the best universities in the United States, and they knew very little bit about politics, but what they did know about was macroeconomic policy. And they were going to sort of change the world and save the PRI, and that way it would turn into the LDP of Japan. And so what happens was when Salinas sort of is humiliated and Zedillo turns over power to the PAN in 2000, roughly speaking, there are obviously exceptions, the technocrats within the PRI either leave the PRI, they go underground, or they go to the PAN. And Santiago Levy is sort of the best example of somebody who went to the PAN. So now, within this sort of understanding of recruitment, political recruitment within the PRI, where does Peña Nieto stand? And he stands, I would say, as sort of the new generation, he's a very young man, I think he's about 45 years old, as he's a young politician who is able to speak like a technocrat and hire, again, some of the smartest economic minds of his generation. However, does that mean, and so he will have no problem speaking to the Americans. American policymaker was telling me that when he went to speak with a very high-level person within the Homeland Security, the Homeland Security person said, "So, are you going to negotiate with a narco?" I mean, it was just like, boom. And Peña Nieto, instead of doing sort of what sometimes can be called the Mexican dance, which is get all upset and to sort of evade the question, I mean, he said, "I think that's a very good question, and I can understand why you would have it. However, I want you to know, of course, we would never negotiate." And then he just danced the guy around the room for the next 20 minutes. So he's extremely astute. He's an extremely good politician, and he does not need to be one of these modern technocrats that sort of govern Mexico in the 80s and 90s, because those kinds of technocrats are now not running the country. They're simply hired guns. And I do think he's going to have a Gutierrez Barrios under his belt. The rents question.
The rents question. So yeah, it's a great question that you're asking. So there's a bunch of people working on this right now. The best formulation I know of is this formulation by a Bangladeshi economist, Mustaf Khan, in the World Bank. And what he says, he says there's like 4 types of rents at least. One is monopolistic rents, natural resource rents similar to oil, so you can extract something, it's sort of kind of free, it's out there. But even those require some skills and some technical, capacity to be able to get them. There's another type of rents, which is the public employee, kind of public sector, public contract kind of rents. You get the privileged access to something that is not really, procured through a clean, transparent system. So that links a lot with the corruption. So we know there's that kind of rents. Then there's the most insidious ones, I think, are the third types, which are these monopolistic rents. Because in monopolistic rents, the firms and the workers are all in favor of those because they provide you a privileged position both as a worker and and finally, what Mustaf Khan points out is there's this thing he calls Schumpeterian rents. And those are the ones I was mentioning when I was saying Carlos Slim, which are actually not necessarily that bad. Slim happened to fall into a sector of the economy with his business acumen in the right moment. He understood how that technology was moving extremely quickly, and he knew that he could, just ride the wave and do it much better than anyone else did. And it's not so hard. I mean, it's the way I say about Slim always is, we can blame the Mexican government for his first 15 billion, but the next 45 billion were self-made. That's not the Mexican government.
Yeah, well, there were a couple of questions. Well, there's a reform of the judicial system in progress. It is scheduled to start in 2016, and it will supposed to move to oral trials like in the U.S. And in principle, it will give more transparency to the trials. No, you're right. The judicial system in Mexico is a mess, to say the least. It's inefficient, it's corrupt, but corruption is everywhere, not only in the judicial system. That's the real problem. From a point of view, that's where we have to start. If you don't solve the problem of corruption, you cannot do anything else. If there is something worse than a corrupt and ill-equipped police is a corrupt and well-equipped police. No, so you don't change that or forget it. No. And obviously you will need to change education. You will need to change many things. A big cultural change. And that's why I'm not optimistic, because it will take years. It is possible to achieve that, but it will take years. That's the problem. And regarding the consumption in the U.S., when I said drug trafficking in Paris provoked the consumption in the U.S. in a big part, but also by the consumption in Europe and the consumption in Mexico and everywhere. If drugs were not consumed in the U.S., will be consumed in other parts, and probably Mexican drug traffickers will be providing drugs to the other parts of the world. So the question is, can we solve the problem of consumption? To be honest, I'm not very optimistic. I think this is something that you have to deal with that. So what you can change? I think you can change the Mexican state. That was my point. I mean, the structural problem I think is in Mexican institutions. They are very weak. They are very corrupt. They just don't work. I mean, obviously, if you have better institutions, the problem won't disappear, but you can manage it at least, and you won't have the beheaded corpses on the streets like right now. That's the farther you can go. Consumption of drugs won't disappear. This is something you have to deal forever. But if you can disappear the violence you have in Mexico, I think will be a good progress. And that, I think this is the purpose of this government, and I really support that. But I mean, you have to deal with that. I mean, it will be great if nobody uses drugs, but sorry, no, this is not going to happen. So, yeah.
I would just wanted to go back to your question about education, because I think that's a really crucial point here. And the reason it is because it comes to this issue of sort of social opportunities, economic inputs, and politics. And education is where it sort of all goes together. And why? Because the CENTE, which is the National Union of Teachers, basically, the National Teachers Union in Mexico, is an extraordinarily powerful union which offers its people up, its teachers, as sort of political mobilizers. And they're extremely good, not just at mobilizing voters, but they're also very good candidates in certain parts of the nation. And in addition to that, because of the dues that teachers pay automatically, it's an extremely wealthy union. And so you really have sort of ground zero in terms of political or electoral importance. Every party wants the CENTE on its side because of the electoral benefits it brings. And so who is going to tell sort of the head of and it's easy to demonize the head of the teachers union. However, anyone else in the same position would do exactly the same thing. So it's no good to personalize her as sort of the demon of Mexican education. The way that the union is set up allows it to provide all these political benefits so that it doesn't have to sort of create incentives, stronger incentives for its teachers to do a better job teaching. And I could tell you a million horror stories that I've heard, but the worst of it is inheriting teachers, what do they call it? Teachers' posts, the official post that you can't really be fired from. So it's like a tenured post. And you can inherit that to your daughter, essentially, or your son, no matter what it does. Another thing is teachers' absenteeism, horrific. And all of this has an impact. And not only that, it's the terrible level of education that's actually. So all of these things come together. And yet the PAN, because it required the work of the CENTE to win the 2006 election, and it really wanted to keep the support of the CENTE, basically said, we're willing, within certain margins of reform, and there were certain reforms, but they were never really taken very seriously. The reforms at the beginning of the Calderon administration sort of died, as many reforms do, for a lack of interest. And that appears to be what's happening as well in the judicial reform, if you listen to certain members of the Supreme Court who are very worried about that reform. It's just sort of dying a forgotten death. So.
One last question.
Well, great presentation. Thank you. I'm very concerned about the brain drain and the capital drain from Mexico. The people that could be able to make those changes or institute those changes have the vision and the education to do so. Many are living in the woodlands. And it's a big concern. But I guess when I think about all the changes that have to happen, I'm wondering, can they happen with the speed that's necessary in a democratic context?
That's sort of like the big question. So
Can I say something? I mean, being one of the brain drains, and I'm the least qualified to morally to answer this question. She went to Mexico, so that's.
So I make up for it.
But the one thing I was going to say is I think one of the big levers of change has to come, and I don't know how to say this without making it sound like demonizing sort of the rich, but to the extent that the rich in Mexico can still buy protection and buy policing and private justice and private education and buy bottles of water that is not going to make them sick. I mean, all these little things, are part of I think what sort of the impetus for change, and think about how even in the world of business, one of the examples I was going to say about the justice system is courts in Mexico are not qualified to really sort of settle even a silly dispute of a pagaré, of a I owe you. And to some extent, that's because the big companies have their great lawyers, they have mediation, they move it somewhere else, they take care of it. All these webs of subcontracting and whatever going on in the informal sector, they have a bunch of thugs. And that's part of the, kind of the extortion and the whatever that we think of it today as, okay, this is the drug trafficking problem, they're diversifying into those sectors, but that thing has been there always. And to some extent, because the justice system has always been like, there's been a justice for the poor and a justice for the rich, and we've never done that bridge. It doesn't quite answer your question, but I think there's something there to really think about.
Okay. Well, no? Okay, so no other questions? Well, thank you for being here tonight.